wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast, where we discuss the ancient philosophy of Stoicism and how it applies to modern life. This week will be a solo episode with me, Dan Monks of Queens, New York City. Today, I would like to expand a little bit on some of the discussion that Steve and I had a couple of weeks ago on the topic of marriage. After our discussion, I thought about the topic of marriage while on my daily walks. During my ruminations, I developed a few more thoughts that I think would be worthwhile to share. To begin, I would like to clarify that I do not support the idea that all 21st century Stoic practitioners ought to marry and have children. I would argue that marriage and children are something that is consistent with Stoicism, and even preferred, but not one of the mandatory duties incumbent on a Stoic. I think it is clear that Musonius Rufus would disagree with me, and he would say that not marrying and procreating is a failure in terms of justice and failing to do our duty as a citizen. I will expand later on why I understand where Musonius Rufus was coming from, especially within his time and place, and why I think things are different in the present moment. As I mentioned in the previous episode on marriage, I have been happily married for 14 years thus far, knock on wood. We have not been blessed with children. It just wasn't in the cards for us. I have no doubt that Musonius Rufus would rebuke me for that. Like Epictetus, Musonius Rufus was not one to mince words. I understand his viewpoint, I think, and for ease of remembrance, I will repeat a quote from the previous marriage episode. For man, evil consists in injustice and cruelty and indifference to a neighbor's trouble, while virtue is brotherly love and goodness and justice and beneficence and concern for the welfare of one's neighbor. With such ideas, I would say, it would be each man's duty to take thought for his own city and to make of his home a rampart for its protection. But the first step toward making his home such a rampart is marriage. Thus, whoever destroys human marriage destroys the home, the city, and the whole human race. For it would not last if there were no procreation of children, and there would be no just and lawful procreation of children without marriage. That the home or the city does not depend upon women alone, or upon men alone, but upon their union is evident. Musonius Rufus, Lecture 14. This reveals a major driver behind Musonius Rufus's assertion that it is our duty to marry and have children. Musonius Rufus was concerned that the city and society as a whole would collapse without procreation within the stable and lawful context of marriage. I have no doubt that that was a major concern for the people of his time. Considering the very high infant and childhood mortality rate, if they were to have subsequent generations of Romans, they needed to produce as many children as possible, and pregnancy and childbirth itself was a risky business in ancient times. As an example of how dangerous childhood was in the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius and Faustina had 14 children together. Of the 14, only 6 survived to see adulthood, and those 14 children would have had access to the finest food and living conditions available in the Roman Empire. But I would argue that Musonius Rufus had more in mind than just the uncertainty of childhood mortality when he advocated for the procreation being a duty. Musonius Rufus references making the home a rampart for the protection of the city, which implies martial concerns. The ancient world was rife with warfare, and the Romans were among the most warlike. It was important to always have new young men available to fill the ranks of the legions and garrisons. Having as many sons as possible was a way to provide the city and the empire with strong arms to wield spears and shields in battle and to defend the city. Providing this defense to your city in the form of children appears to have been the duty of a citizen in the eyes of Musonius Rufus, and failing to do so showed a lack of concern for your neighbors and your city. Failure to have children would be an injustice in this conception. Fast forward to the 21st century. Infant and childhood mortality has decreased precipitously in the developed world. There are more than 8 billion humans on the planet. My own country, the United States of America, has more than 340 million people. Considering the impact humanity is currently having on the natural world, we could probably do with having fewer humans, not more. Addressing Musonius Rufus's martial concerns, in the USA, fewer than 7% of Americans are military veterans or are presently in the military. The military has become the province of a very small percentage of the citizenry. So, in the 21st century, an individual failing to have children would not leave their city or nation defenseless. To sum up, I understand why Musonius Rufus, in the context of his time and place, argued that having children within the context of marriage was a duty. However, in the 21st century, I would argue that while having children is coherent within Stoicism, perhaps even preferred, but in the modern age, it is not an injustice to your neighbors to fail to procreate. Procreation was not the only thing that I ruminated on during my walks. In marriage, as in every relationship between humans, there is the potential for conflict. Disagreements will happen. One way to minimize or even negate conflict is to practice the Stoic spiritual exercise of Prosoche. What is Prosoche? In the Inner Citadel, Pierre Hadot describes Prosoche as the fundamental Stoic attitude. Prosoche is the continuous, rigid attention to the present moment, our present sense impressions, our judgments of those impressions, and the formation of appropriate actions in response to those impressions and judgments. It is closely related to what other disciplines and schools would call mindfulness. Prosoche is necessary to bring Stoicism to fruition in your life, and it takes constant practice. You cannot just wait for high-pressure moments and then remember Prosoche. Chances are it's too late at that point. If you are in the habit of going through daily life unreflectively on autopilot, you are not an active force in your life. Instead, you are reacting to your environment, dancing on the strings of your habitual reactions. Here is where Prosoche ties into marriage. Prosoche is what greatly enhances the awareness necessary to withhold assent to an impression. When disagreement arises in your marriage, instead of automatically and instinctively going on the offense, you must have the presence of mind to realize that the person you love is in distress, and if you are experiencing a protopassion of anger yourself, that you should withhold assent to the impression that you have been injured. Your goal when interacting with your spouse is not to win arguments. As a Stoic practitioner, your goal is to live according to nature. Living according to nature means fulfilling our nature as rational and social beings. So, instead of victory being the goal becomes rejecting anger, and instead behaving justly and lovingly toward your spouse. Remember that the default for justice is kindness. How much more so should that be when in reference to your spouse? What matters more, victory in an argument or a loving relationship with your spouse? Living according to nature and behaving as a rational and social animal was what Epictetus was referring to when he admonished his students to keep themselves in a natural state in relation to their spouses. If marriage is given to him, he is to keep himself in a natural state in those circumstances. But if he wills that his son or his wife should never commit a fault, then he wills to make his own what is not his own. Education consists in this, to learn what is one's own and what is not. Where, then, is there any room for contention if a man bears himself thus? Epictetus, Discourses, Book 4.5. That is not to say that a Stoic practitioner is called upon to give in every time we are confronted with a dispute. But we must reject anger as a response to disagreement. Anger clouds our judgment, puts blinders on us, and leads to all sorts of ill-considered actions and statements. Anger is never beneficial. So, instead of angrily pressing for victory, our goal is to maintain our equanimity so that we can understand where our spouse is coming from and give it an honest evaluation. If you are completely in the wrong, own it and change your stance accordingly. Nobody said Stoicism is easy. However, if after hearing your spouse's position and you do not agree completely, Try to communicate where you agree with them and where your position differs, so that discussion can begin. Try your best to find a final outcome where you can both be satisfied, or at least not angry with each other. Most of the thoughts I have expressed thus far relate primarily to casual day-to-day disagreements and struggles. One way to minimize the chances that you will have drastic calamitous strife in your marriage is to follow the advice of Musonius Rufus, and before marrying someone, make sure that they have a similar orientation to virtue that you do. If you are marrying someone because they are beautiful, wealthy, or have prestigious connections, influence, and power, remember that all those things are ephemeral. All those externals could be gone tomorrow. As Musonius Rufus wisely pointed out, what matters is the character of your spouse to be. Their virtue is the only thing of real value when deciding whether it would be prudent to marry them. When I say that the person you are considering for marriage should have a similar orientation toward virtue that you do, I am not saying that they must also be a Stoic practitioner. If that were the case, very few marriages would happen in the Stoic community. Judging by the online Stoic community, only somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Stoic community are ladies. That math does not math, unless the Stoic community has a higher rate of dudes that are into dudes than is found in the general population. So, most of us will have to look outside the Stoic community for potential spouses. It is rare that someone can overcome the selfishness and greed common to the masses of humanity without conscious effort in some sort of framework. When looking for a spouse that similarly prioritizes virtue, you can find them in many places. If you are fortunate enough to find a fellow Stoic practitioner that is willing to put up with your flaws, and you are willing to put up with theirs, then rejoice. But as previously mentioned, if you are a guy Stoic, you will likely have to look elsewhere. I think other philosophical schools and religions are perfectly acceptable as long as they have a conception of virtue that is not anathema to your own. Read a few basic books about your potential spouse's favorite thinkers to see what they say about virtue, or don't say about virtue. If you are dating a religious person and things get serious between you, it may be prudent to go to Mass with them a few times. If their church emphasizes welcoming the stranger, healing the sick, and does not emphasize the acquisition of wealth, that would be evidence that the person you are dating views virtue in a matter that is not inconsistent with cosmopolitanism. However, if you go to the church and it is a platform for xenophobia, misogyny, and greed, that would be a serious red flag in my humble opinion. One last suggestion I have for marital harmony is the Stoic spiritual exercise of Memento Mori. Memento Mori is Latin for remember that you will die. You take some time each day to remember the ephemeral nature of human life. Memento Mori refers not only to our own mortality, but everyone we care about. Many people instinctively recoil from contemplating the mortality of their spouse and children, because it seems shockingly morbid to them, as if contemplating the mortality of yourself and your loved ones can bring about bad luck. Or it may seem as if you are hoping for such an event to come to pass, but that is not the case. Memento Mori can make you more appreciative of the people you have in your life, in the present moment. Recognition that you could lose your spouse or child, or that they could lose you, will make you realize how fortunate you are to have what you do, and care more for and appreciate the people you have in your life. The mindfulness of the temporary nature of life will likely inspire you to make better use of your time with your spouse and child, and not squander your time on empty time-wasting pursuits. Having a family is wonderful, and we should appreciate them as much as we can, and show it through our actions. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send us an email at sundaystoic@gmail.com. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on whatever platform you use to listen to us. Your feedback helps us to reach new audience members and to build the podcast. We look forward to releasing a new episode next week, fate permitting. And as Steve always says, Carpe Diem!